Hey everyone, welcome back. We're doing a deep dive today on something that might sound kind of dry at first glance, but trust me, it's juicy stuff.
Yeah, this is a good one.
It is. We're talking Acts chapter 15, the Jerusalem Council. Early church went through some major growing pains, and we're going to figure out what happened.
It's kind of like a reality show, but with way higher stakes.
Right, like eternal stakes.
Exactly.
So our source material today is a sermon from December 29th, 2024. Speaker didn't give his name, but he kept mentioning that this Bernie guy seems like a big deal in his church. Anyways, right out the gate, he jumps into this whole dispensationalism thing. And to be honest, I kind of got lost.
Yeah, that can be a bit of a brain twister.
Can you break it down for us? What's the significance?
Okay, so think of it like reading a really long book, right? Like an epic saga. Each chapter has its own setting, rules, sometimes even different characters taking the lead. Dispensationalism is kind of like saying God interacts with humanity in these different chapters throughout history.
So what the speaker's trying to say is that what was considered biblically correct back then, like circumcision being a requirement, might not apply the same way under the gospel of grace, which is like the chapter we're in now.
Exactly. And that's where things get interesting, because then the question becomes, how do we interpret those older parts of the story in light of where we are now? How do we reconcile those seeming contradictions?
Okay, that actually makes a lot more sense now. So before we get to all the drama of the Jerusalem Council, the speaker talks about this private meeting Paul has with James, John, and Peter, the big three of the early church.
Yeah, heavy hitters right there.
What went down in that meeting?
Well, it's important to remember that Paul, he got his message straight from Christ, right? So this meeting wasn't about getting his message like approved or anything. It was more about making sure these other leaders understood how Paul was bringing Gentiles into the church without requiring them to follow every single Jewish law.
And I love how the speaker pointed out the specific Greek word used for running when describing Paul's efforts. Kiko implies this really dedicated, intentional effort, like Paul was laser focused on his mission.
Totally. He was running a marathon, not a sprint. He knew spreading this gospel of grace was going to be a long and tough journey.
I like that. A marathon, not a sprint. And it's so interesting how the speaker connects this ancient struggle to navigate different views to all the debates we have today.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Like how people are clashing over same-sex marriage, critical race theory, all those hot-button issues.
Exactly. He's making it clear there are things he considers sinful, stuff he can't just tolerate. It really highlights that tension that's always there,
Yeah,
Tolerance versus standing firm on what you believe is absolute truth.
it's a struggle.
Sure.
I think we all grapple with that in some way.
For sure.
Okay, so let's talk about Peter. He seems totally on board at first with this idea that salvation through grace applies to everyone, Gentiles included, but then things get a little messy.
Right. It's like he hit a roadblock.
Yeah, what happened?
Well, the speaker paints a bit of an unflattering picture of Peter here. He points out that when James, Jesus' half-brother, who was a big leader in the Jerusalem church, when James shows up, Peter suddenly stops eating with the Gentiles.
Oh, so he's like backpedaling.
Yeah, and the speaker even goes so far as to call Peter a hypocrite for doing that.
Ouch. That's a pretty harsh judgment.
It is.
I mean, what was Peter thinking? Was he just trying to keep everyone happy,
Yeah,
not rock the boat too much? We've all been there.
totally. And to be honest, I'm not sure the speaker is giving Peter enough credit here. It's easy to judge from our 21st century perspective, but we have to remember the pressure these guys were under. Building a whole new faith from scratch, that's a lot to handle.
Very true. So speaking of Jewish tradition, let's talk about James. This guy's like a walking paradox. He's known as James the Just, super strict, follows the Jewish law to a T, but then he writes the letter to the church in Antioch saying, Gentiles don't have to be circumcised. What's up with that?
Right. How do we reconcile those two things? Well, first, you got to understand where James was coming from. The speaker pointed out that James didn't even believe Jesus was divine at first. He just thought of Jesus as his half-brother.
Wow, that's wild. So what changed his mind?
According to the speaker, it was witnessing the resurrected Christ with his own eyes. Talk about a life-changing experience.
That'll do it. Okay, but then the speaker throws in this curveball. He questions whether James actually believed in the gospel of grace when he wrote that letter.
Yeah, he suggests that maybe it was more of a political move. Maybe James was just trying to smooth things over.
Keep everyone happy.
Exactly. Or maybe he was genuinely persuaded by the arguments at the council. There was a lot of back and forth.
So was he a true believer or just playing politics?
It's hard to say for sure.
It's a great question, though. And it makes you think about all the stuff that goes into shaping religious doctrine. It's not always so neat and tidy.
Definitely not.
Well, before we get into the letter itself and all the fallout from the council, we need to take a quick break. But stick around. We'll be right back with more juicy details about how this decision shaped the future of Christianity.
All right, so picking up where we left off, let's dig into the letter itself. The speaker points out that it wasn't just James who wrote it, it was all the apostles and elders of the Jerusalem church.
Okay, so it was like a group effort, not just James calling the shots. But I'm still stuck on why the speaker keeps saying James might not have been sincere in his message.
Well, he's trying to show the Jerusalem church as this very traditional institution, super focused on Jewish law. Remember, this is the same James who didn't even believe Jesus was divine at first. He had to see the resurrected Christ with his own eyes to be convinced.
Right, right. It's kind of hard to imagine going from doubting Jesus to leading the church.
I know, right? So the speaker's wondering, could someone with that background really get behind this radical idea of salvation by grace alone?
Hmm.
Interesting point. And he even brings up that moment where Peter stopped eating with the Gentiles when James showed up. Like maybe James's presence pressured Peter to conform to those Jewish customs.
Oh, I see. It's like he's trying to get inside James's head, trying to figure out what his real motivations were.
And he wants us to do the same. He asks the listener directly, do you truly believe James believed in the gospel of the grace of God?
Whoa, that's heavy. It really makes you think about what might have been going on behind the scenes with those early church leaders.
Yeah.
Personal conviction, political pressure, maybe even protecting their own power.
Yeah, who knows? And it shows that history isn't always so black and white. Even the most important people can be full of contradictions.
So true. Okay, so the letter says Gentile converts don't have to be circumcised, but it also has those 4 big no-nos. No food offered to idols, no blood, no meat from strangled animals, and no sexual immorality. Why all those rules?
Well, the speaker digs into the culture back then to explain it. Imagine being a Jewish believer in a world where most of the meat you can buy has been offered to idols. That's a big deal, right?
Yeah, for sure. That'd make things pretty tricky.
Totally. Now, Paul, he had a more relaxed view on this stuff, arguing that idols had no real power, so the meat wasn't actually contaminated. But for Jewish believers, it was a serious violation of their faith.
So these prohibitions were more about respecting Jewish beliefs and keeping everyone united than about setting strict rules for salvation.
That's what the speaker argues. And it makes sense when you realize the early church was still this mix of Jewish and Gentile believers trying to find a way to live and worship together, even with their different backgrounds.
It's like what the speaker said before, how Christianity didn't just pop up out of nowhere. It was tied to all that existing culture and religion.
Right. It's a good reminder that no religion exists in a bubble. They change and adapt over time, depending on the context.
Okay, so even with those restrictions, the letter was received with great rejoicing in Antioch. If they still had to follow those rules, why were people so happy?
Because it meant they were finally accepted as full members of the Christian community without having to follow all those Jewish laws. It was a huge victory for the Gentile Christians.
Like their own Declaration of Independence.
You got it. But the speaker also points out that the fight wasn't over. There were still those folks, the Judaizers, who insisted that circumcision and following the Mosaic law were essential for salvation.
So even with the council and the letter, the debate wasn't totally settled. It's like those theological arguments that never really go away. They just keep coming back in different forms.
That's such a good point. It shows how those ancient struggles still matter today. We're still wrestling with how to interpret scripture, how to balance tradition and change, and how to define what our faith really means.
So what happens next? Does everyone just skip off into the sunset now that the council has spoken?
Not exactly. Things actually get even more complicated when Paul and Barnabas have that big blow-up.
Right. We talked about that before, but the speaker gives us more juicy details that make the whole thing even more interesting.
He goes over how the main issue was Barnabas wanting to bring John Mark along on their mission trip, even though Mark bailed on them before. But the speaker hints that there might have been more to it.
Like some deeper theological disagreements.
You got it. He thinks maybe Barnabas was sympathetic to the Judaizers, those who wanted to keep a stronger focus on Jewish law. And remember, the church actually praised Paul, not Barnabas, for being faithful, even though Barnabas was the one pushing for forgiveness and second chances.
It's almost like we're supposed to see Paul as the hero and Barnabas as someone who maybe went astray.
It's definitely a thought-provoking way to see it, but the speaker doesn't say that outright, He wants the listener to decide how they interpret the situation.
So Paul heads off with Silas, And they start sharing the letter from Jerusalem with all the churches, spreading the word that Gentile converts are officially part of the family.
Right, and it seems like people are happy about it. But then, plot twist, Paul actually circumcises Timothy, a young disciple who becomes one of his closest buddies.
Wait, what? I thought Paul was totally against circumcision for Gentile believers.
He was, but this is where the speaker's attention to detail is really cool. He explains that Timothy's mom was Jewish while his dad was Greek. So technically, Timothy wasn't bound by Jewish law because his dad wasn't Jewish.
Oh, I get it. So it wasn't about salvation, it was about cultural sensitivity. Paul being practical.
Exactly. Timothy grew up in a Jewish community, and not being circumcised would have made things really tough for him there. Paul was just trying to avoid conflict and make things easier for Timothy.
So even Paul, who was so passionate about the freedom we get through the gospel of grace, knew that sometimes you have to adjust your approach depending on the situation.
It shows just how tough leadership can be and the wisdom you need to figure out those gray areas where your principles clash with the realities of life.
This deep dive has been a wild ride. We've had intense debates, complex personalities, even some church drama. But there's one last twist in the story that I think is worth exploring. Okay, so we've talked about how the speaker kind of portrays James as this strict, by-the-book leader who might not even fully get the whole gospel of grace thing.
Yeah, he definitely didn't paint the most flattering picture of him.
Right. And he even criticized Peter for flip-flopping when James was around.
Like Peter was walking on eggshells.
Exactly. But then he mentions this part in Acts where Paul actually goes to James for advice and updates him on all his work with the Gentiles. What's up with that? Doesn't that contradict everything he said before?
It totally does. It really made me think, why would Paul go to James for guidance if he thought James was holding him back?
It's like we're seeing two different versions of James. The strict rule follower versus this respected leader that even Paul listens to.
It's a real puzzle. Maybe the speaker's still figuring out James's role in the whole story. Or maybe he's showing us that these guys were complicated. Just like everyone else, they weren't always who we think they should be.
That's a good point. It's more relatable, right? Even these big names in the Bible, they weren't perfect. They had their own struggles.
Definitely. It reminds us not to put people in boxes. They were real people, dealing with real life stuff, trying to figure it all out as they went along.
So after all this back and forth, what's the big takeaway? Where does the speaker leave us?
He ends by connecting Paul's mission to what Christians are called to do today. He talks about how Paul was totally dedicated to spreading the gospel of grace, especially to those who were left out before.
Yeah, and he tells his listeners to follow Paul's example, to be brave in sharing the message of grace and to fight against teachings that twist the real meaning of the gospel.
He's saying this isn't just ancient history, it's a challenge for us right now.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question. Imagine you were a Gentile back then, brand new to the church. Where would you stand in all this? Which side would you be on? What would make you decide?
It's a great question. Really makes you think about your own beliefs and how you understand the scriptures.
That's what this deep dive is all about, getting you to really engage with these ideas.
Sometimes asking the right questions is more important than having all the answers.
Well, we hope this deep dive got you thinking and inspired you to keep exploring early Christianity. It's fascinating stuff.
Absolutely.